Well, I know that it's topical in Australia because of Bill 70 coming in.
From the criminal code, which is the anti-bribery legislation.
Yes. You know, my view is that we're at the apex of this anti-corruption hysteria, if you will. The United States has been pounding the OECD to pound other countries to ensure that American companies aren't disadvantaged by following the FCPA. And what that's done is it's part, in my view, of an attempt to further import American law internationally and give U.S. companies this level playing ground against the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians. To that extent, it is also, from a foreign policy standpoint, something that would be seen as sterilizing China's dominance in some of these markets. And the Americans are more and more using law as a tool, as a foreign policy tool, and we see that with sanctions. And of course now we're seeing this major reaction in the form of Russia and Venezuela adopting cryptocurrencies, and Putin reacting very aggressively and massively to the sanctions regime. I believe that a lot of the anti-corruption legislation will have to be amended.
Well, it's a good thing at its base, though. It's a good thing, right? A lot of anti-corruption authorities are being set up around the world to keep it a level playing field.
I don't really think it's working the way it's planned. I see a tremendous amount of political uses of this legislation to attack opponents. We need to remember one of the first anti-corruption campaigns was adopted by Yuri Andropov, former head of the KGB when he became the leader of Russia. He was one of the first ones on these anti-corruption drives. The war on terror and the war on corruption, anytime you have a war declared relative to a need for legislation, it's almost setting the stage for abuse. I've seen some of the Australian draft legislation. And what we're doing is we're tremendously watering down rule of law. Who the hell knows how a company is supposed to prepare itself for that legislation? Where is the standard? Who's drafting this crap? Because getting in front of a judge to try to explain to what extent you could mitigate the risk of corruption,
whether you knew was actually...
And whether you knew, and the millions and millions and millions of dollars that experts are going to be paid to set up these compliance regimes, and all of the innocent lives that will be ruined in this country as a result of what I've seen in other countries, which is fairly bogus investigations done by individuals who don't have a tremendous business sense. And I will tell you that what it means is that emerging markets are losing out on the best American companies, the best Canadian companies, the best British companies, because these companies are deciding they don't have the scope to enter into markets where they need that level of compliance.
It's too risky. It's too risky.
It's too risky from the standpoint of their key personnel. Because the United States DOJ recently has made it very clear they're interested in scalps. It is now, in the U.S., been viewed as a big tax. It's almost, in many people's minds, an FCPA attack is a political, economic tax.
What's FCPA, just for...
Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Okay.
But there's been a recent memo out of the DOJ that's really calling for individual culpability. In Britain, we've had people who go to jail. Somebody who pleaded guilty into LIBOR rigging got 14 years, while some of the people he worked with who fought were acquitted. The SFO has, in a number of cases I'm aware of, behaved in a fairly scandalous manner in how they've approached some of these cases. In fact, one of their experts in a recent case has been pilloried for his conduct in and out of the box. There is simply been, it's almost like the war on tobacco. There's been this attempt to reshape a culture. You know, I'm old enough to remember when in Germany and other countries, people would declare the bribes they had to pay to ensure they got the tax deduction.
Essentially, you're saying that these local anti-corruption authorities are being used as clubs and attacks on political opponents.
Kenya's Daryl Arap Moi, who came in on an anti-corruption platform, turned out to be Kenya's most corrupt leader. Buhari in Nigeria came in on an anti-corruption platform. He's become Africa's most inept leader. Brazil has been brought to its knees with a corruption scandal. Peru has just...
Well, it's good, isn't it? Right? Let's blow up some of these corruption matters.
It is. And it's in Latin America and in Africa, some of these changes are positive. But there is tremendous collateral damage to our investor community that we're simply not seeing. And taking away defenses and watering down intent so that we can keep people in Australia busy in the police force.
Well, that is the basis of the new Australian legislation, actually.
It just seems to be insane. And I would tell you that what I represent, I'm privileged to represent a number of Australian companies operating in Africa. And unlike the United States, the Australian government is asleep at the switch. And I condemn them for it. This is a government that doesn't seem to care about its own companies' behavior in Africa. And I mean positive behavior. I mean the fact Australian investors have gone into Africa heroically. And now in Tanzania and other countries, they're under pressure, and this government's doing nothing.
To support them?
To support them, absolutely.
Okay, so you'd need nerves of steel, wouldn't you now, if you're an Australian investor going into a risky place like Africa? You've got the added risk now of your own courts and police chasing you as well. At some point, people are just going to go, oh,
well, in fact, you know, for those who are miners and explorers, you have the problem that the people who finance you are not going to be interested in financing you. So you're not even going to get to Africa because the people who finance you here in Sydney are going to say, screw off. Yeah. So I think the government needs to try to have a pragmatic approach to some of these issues.
So who can go into Africa now? If it's caution alarms being rung in America, Australia and Britain, who's...
Well, look, I don't have to tell anybody that the Chinese and the Indians are all over the place in Africa with bags full of cash. And what's fascinating is we have governments in this country and my country talking about green energy and talking about the next generation of energy, the end of oil. What you need for green energy are rare earth minerals that the Chinese are buying up by the bushel to the point that very little will be left. We will become hostages to China because we have disincentivized our own companies to go into some of these difficult, dangerous regions. And not only that, with this somewhat ridiculous behavior of the NGOs right now in Africa, talking about illicit fund transfers. I mean, countries like Kabila's Congo, perhaps the most corrupt government in Africa today, they're coming up with a new mining code, applauded by many of these NGOs, and that Kabila cabal will steal now that much more money from investors under cover of these recent illicit financial flows and another UNCTAD report on misinvoicing, which lacks all sorts of grounding in fact. Once again, we have this huge scope of political correctness we have to fight. And you know, the Australian government, among others, is applauding rather than supporting the investors of Australia that need some protection.
All right, well, last question though, is there opportunity there And can people be taken to that opportunity?
Yes, I mean, I still believe there's opportunity in many of these countries. And I certainly believe Australian companies, big and small, should be pounding on the door of government to change this legislation and to support Australian investors overseas.
Thanks for joining us, Bob.
Pleasure.